Well, as Johnny quite rightly said today, I'm going to give a talk about the first chaplain that came to Newcastle. That was George Augustus Middleton. As of Wednesday next week, the 10th of March, it'll be exactly 200 years since he was appointed to Newcastle. So that's a particularly interesting sort of a date. I mean, for the information I've got on Middleton, I'm quite indebted to Brian Roach. Dr. Brian Roach did his thesis on Middleton, so quite a bit of the information that I've gathered has come from his thesis plus other sources. I'm also very grateful to other people for information I've been able to put together too, particularly thankful to the exchange of information we get from this group here in Hunter Living History. It's a tremendous exchange of information on all sorts of things. And I'm also grateful to Suzanne Martin too for a lot of material she's given me on early Newcastle and one of her favourite topics, Governor Lachlan Macquarie too. And I'm also grateful to Ken and Marie Schilling for information as well. Marie's given me a lot of information on some of the conditions in Newcastle, particularly relating to floggings and other forms of punishment. So I'm not sure what that says about Marie, but that's the sort of information I've been getting. By way of background, I'm finishing a biographical book on the chaplains, bishops and deans of Newcastle from 1821 to 2021. And this came about as a spin-off from another book that I'm writing on the history of Christchurch Cathedral, Newcastle. And in writing the book on the cathedral, I wanted to get some information on the bishops and deans and how they were involved in the development of the cathedral. And as I started doing the research on those bishops and deans, I started looking at the background of the early clergy who were involved in Newcastle prior to the cathedral even being a gleam in the eye. So an obvious question is, what's important about Middleton and these chaplains? Well, I recognise the date and the man. And the stories that I found about these clergymen told me a lot about the conditions in the colony and the early settlement of Newcastle. A lot of the chaplains came to Newcastle, obviously from England with a very English background. And if they stayed in England, they would have had a very simple life as a village parson. And of course, when they came to Australia, or New South Wales at the time, the colony of New South Wales, very, very different. They were appointed by the Crown and they were effectively under military rule in the colony too. There was no church organisation whatsoever, but they were answerable to the Bishop of London, which must have been a little bit of a tricky thing to try to balance. You've got a governor in the colony telling you what to do, and you've got the Bishop of London telling you a little bit about what to do. And so here they are, those chaplains are in the colony trying to bring religion to a convict settlement. And of course, the convict settlement was of severe punishment. So while they were here, they travelled long distances, and of course, there were no defined roads or tracks for them to follow. They had to try to carry out their pastoral duties as celebrants for births, deaths, and marriages. Also try to give comfort to the sick, the dying, and those unfortunately condemned as well. So I found out a lot about their background education, their training, their lives before, during and after their term of office in Newcastle, and also their roles as teachers and farmers. And Middleton's story, therefore, is a very prime example of the sort of difficulties that the early chaplains in the colony had, trying to bring religion to a convict settlement. To provide an understanding of conditions confronting Middleton when he came to New South Wales, I'll just give a very brief outline or background to the first two chaplains in the colony, and then I'll also give a little bit of detail about the conditions in Newcastle when Middleton turned up. So the first chaplain to the colony in New South Wales was the Reverend Richard Johnson. He came out on the First Fleet on the ship the Golden Grove with his wife, Mary, and his appointment, of course, was through letters patent from King George III. As I might have mentioned earlier, all the chaplains were Crown appointments. His main role was to be the protector of morality for everyone in the colony, that's convicts and soldiers. And that would have been a tough job, I think. He conducted his first religious service on the 3rd of February, that was 8 days after the First Fleet arrived, and allegedly it was under a tree in Macquarie Place Park on Bridge Street, which is just near Circular Quay. He was the only clergyman in the colony, and he was understandably very busy. He conducted a lot of marriage ceremonies. It was, once they all landed and got off the ships, they all thought they might be a good idea to get married, so he was very busy carrying out marriage ceremonies. And then following that, of course, baptisms and then later funerals. And he visited a lot of convicts in jail and, of course, those that were condemned to be executed too. He set out to try to reform the convicts, seeing himself as what he called a physician to the soul. That's a term he coined himself. He also befriended the Indigenous people in the area, including Bennelong. He had very little success with preaching to the convicts and to the military. He asked them all to observe the Sabbath. This is probably naive of me. Asked them all to observe the Sabbath, not use bad language, not to steal, not to commit adultery, but to pray and read the Bible. And of course, he was a bit naive with that. He didn't realise that most of the convicts couldn't read. And so, unfortunately, a lot of the pages in the Bibles came to an unfortunate end, as you can well imagine. Importantly for the colony and for Middleton, before joining the clergy, Johnson had been a farmer in England. He'd been in the colony. He was allocated a glebe of 400 acres, and a glebe was a patch of land that the government allocated to each of the parishes or the clergy. And the idea of that was that they could graze their own animals, grow their own crops, and get a bit of extra support from that. So, together with his 400 acres of glebe, he also acquired for himself a 350-acre property, and there he grew fruit, vegetables, grains and tobacco. And fortunately for the colony, when food was in short supply, Johnson's knowledge of farming and how to grow produce was very, very helpful. And at one stage, he helped save the colony from starvation by being able to produce and show others how to produce food. The second chaplain I just wanted to talk about briefly was the Reverend Samuel Marsden. He and his wife arrived in the colony in March 1794, and he was almost immediately stationed at Parramatta. And he found too, as Johnson had, that the convicts were quite anti-religious, and he had very little success in bringing religion to them. So Marsden did a few things very quickly. He built a timber church at Parramatta. He created a Sunday school and an orphanage. And he also took longer-term missionary work in the Pacific Islands, in Tahiti, and in particular to New Zealand. He took 7 missions to New Zealand. And to supplement his income too, Marsden also got involved in farming after he arrived. He was running cattle and sheep and pigs, and he ended up being a real expert on agriculture in the colony, and he was well regarded not only by Governors King and Bligh, but the word got across back to England to King George III, who actually gave him a flock of his own merino sheep. So Marsden became quite an outstanding man in the colony, a very prosperous farmer, and produced wool. And by about 1807, he had about 3,000 acres of land, and he progressively acquired some more land, and he became quite wealthy and important, much more than he ever could have been back in England. And he was also made a magistrate too. So it can be seen from just those two chaplains, from Johnson and Marsden, that they were encountering conditions very different to those that an English parson would have encountered. And apart from their pastoral duties, they developed rural interests as well. And at the same time, it was elevating their position in society. And so just as a bit of background to Newcastle, I'll just give a little bit of detail there too. So although Newcastle had been briefly settled in 1801 under Corporal Wixted, it wasn't really until 1804 that the settlement of Newcastle started to get some momentum. That was following the Irish Rebellion in Sydney in 1804, and Newcastle was designed or set up to be a place of severe punishment, not only for the rebels but also for re-offenders in the colony too. And initially it was under the command of Commandant Marine Lieutenant Charles Menzies. Just as a bit of a side note too, Menzies left Newcastle in 1805 and went back to England, and he ended up fighting under Nelson in the Napoleonic Wars. And he later became a general and aide-de-camp to Queen Victoria. So from if you like, a humble beginning as commandant in Newcastle, he certainly moved up quite well from there. He had a son who became a colonel in engineers, and the son married a lady with the wonderful name of Lushington Burke. I really like Lushington Burke. And Her brother was Robert O'Hara Burke, of course, of Burke and Wills fame. So there's a bit of a connection. When Menzies was commandant in Newcastle, he was only around 21 or 22, so he's quite young to have that role. So the convicts, back to conditions in Newcastle. The convicts in Newcastle had to endure hard labour, often in chains. They had reduced rations. They were getting about half of what the rations were issued to the convicts in Sydney. Had a lack of clothing. Sometimes the clothing just wore out and they had to work with no clothes. Accommodation was very poor and, of course, very inadequate medical treatment too. So consequently, they suffered from high levels of illness and mortality, a lot of diseases, dysentery and scurvy. They didn't get any vegetables, and they did get some meat, and some of it was contaminated meat from Tahuti, and they had weevils in the wheat too. So altogether, not a terrific place to be. Punishment included further hard labour in the mines, timber cutting, which was a very, very, very tough job out in the bush. They had to work on the construction of the Macquarie Pier. They had to build a jail. They were sometimes put in solitary confinement, and a lot of floggings, as Maria's given me some good information. The floggings varied from, I think, 11 to about 102 lashes. And that wouldn't have been something to look forward to. Some of the convicts were hanged for murder, rape, stabbing, or even attempting to escape. And so all of these punishments led to a very high level of fear and resentment for the convicts, for anybody in authority, anyone at all. And so Menzies, as with all of the commandants in Newcastle, had been instructed by the governor to conduct church services, and of course attendance was compulsory and punishable if you didn't attend without a good reason. So again, that started to build up resentment against the church and the chaplains too. So Captain James Wallace arrived in Newcastle as commandant in June 1816, and conditions were still pretty much the same. He didn't immediately follow on from Menzies. He followed on from a Lieutenant Thompson, and there'd been quite a few commandants between Menzies and Thompson, and James Wallace followed on in 1816 from Lieutenant Thompson. He had instruction from Governor Macquarie to build quite a few structures, and one of them was to be a church to serve all denominations. And the idea of building the church was to, if you like, improve the moral character of the prisoners, which sounded like quite an ambitious sort of a thing to try to do. This is the church that Wallace organised to be built. It was designed by James Clohessy and Joseph Lycett, and it was to accommodate 500 people, and it was all under the instructions of Captain Wallace. Construction took place between 1817 and 18, and for some reason, but I haven't quite found out yet, the church was built the wrong way around. So the altar, instead of being at the east end, was at the west end. And but anyway, that's another story I'll get to another day. So Governor Macquarie visited Newcastle in August 1818, and he arrived on the ship, the Elizabeth Henrietta, and it dropped anchor off Newcastle in late July 1818. And this gives you an idea of the layout of the town at the time, or the settlement at the time too. And a lot of those street names that are on there have all, of course, been changed. George Street is actually Watt Street, and Wallace Street is actually King Street. So Wallace had obviously been fairly free with using his own name to call Wallace Hill, Wallace Street, Wallace Plains, so he really made his mark.
Can I just say that Pacific
Yes.
Street used to be called Cowper Street after the river?
That's spot on. Yeah, I'd forgotten that. Thanks, Susie. Yeah, that's exactly right. But just as a personal footnote, if I can throw it in, when the governor's ship dropped anchor off Newcastle Harbour, his barge was guided into the harbour by the harbour pilot, and that harbour pilot was my great-great-great-grandfather, William Eckford. He was my first ancestor in Australia. He arrived in 1801, but again, that's another story. When Macquarie arrived in 1818, he was accompanied by Chaplain William Cowper, as Susan just pointed out. He'd arrived in the colony in 1809, and he'd been extremely busy because there were hardly any chaplains in the place at all in those days. Just as an example of how busy he was, in 1810 he performed 187 marriages, including 18 in one day. So he's obviously a busy boy. Cowper was the first clergyman to conduct divine service in Newcastle, which he did on the 2nd of August 1818. And as another incentive for the convicts to attend, they were all given extra meat rations too. And the following day, he performed the marriage ceremony for 10 couples, and one of them was James Clohessy, who designed the church. So he was one of the 10 couples that got married. And they baptised 30 children. And again, on a personal note there, if I can add it in, 5 of those 30 children were children of William and Mary Eckford, so relatives of mine as well. So when Wallace returned to Sydney in 1819, he was replaced by Brevet Major James Morisset, and he figures quite prominently in Middleton's fate a bit further down the line. Morisset was noted as a very strict and authoritarian commandant. He ordered punishment to continue to maintain discipline, and he too created a sense of fear and resentment in the convicts. And the harsh punishment, of course, meant flogging and hangings. Just prior to Middleton arriving in Newcastle, there was a commission of inquiry conducted into the colony between 1818 and 1821. It was conducted by John Thomas Bigg, the Bigg Inquiry. He'd been a judge in England and over in the West Indies too before he came to the colony. He was instructed to investigate conditions in the colony, its future as a convict settlement, and also surreptitiously into Governor Macquarie's administration. And Suzanne's mentioned a good bit about that to me before too, so thanks for that. Bigg's secretary was his brother-in-law, Thomas Hobbs Scott, who would also figure prominently in Middleton's future too, and very adversely, I might add. One of the issues that came out of the Bigg Inquiry was the need for the colony to have a church leader to address the needs for religion, morality and education too. And the Bigg Commission also pointed to the need for a full-time chaplain in Newcastle. So this is the headstone for Middleton. I've hunted around for any portraits or images of him that might be available. Brian did that when he was doing his masters, and we just haven't been able to turn up anything yet. So the best I could do was provide his an image of his headstone, and that's in the Morpeth Cemetery, in the Anglican section of the Morpeth Cemetery. And after some years afterwards, 3 of the bishops of the diocese were buried there too: Tyrrell, Batty, and Stanton. But again, that's another story. So George Augustus Middleton was to be the first chaplain to Newcastle. He was born in 1791. His father was an architect. He must have been a good guy. And he was an engraver too. Middleton attended Cambridge University, but he didn't actually graduate. And when he was at Cambridge, he'd been a sizer. And a sizer is a student who hasn't got the money to pay for his fees or tuition, so he does odd jobs for other students or other people on the campus to get enough money to be able to pay the tuition. So just remember that for a little bit later. He intended to join the clergy after if he had got a degree, but didn't work out that way. So he became a teacher, and unfortunately, his wife died. His wife Mary died 3 months after they gave birth to their son George. But interestingly, by a parliamentary act in 1818, Middleton was able to be ordained as a chaplain, but suitable only to British colonies. If you didn't have a degree, you couldn't be a member of the clergy in England, but you could be licensed to become a chaplain in British colonies. So subsequently, he applied for a position as a colonial chaplain. He was made a deacon in July 1818, and to give you an idea of how fast they wanted to run him through, 2 weeks after being made a deacon, he was ordained a priest. So they were really pushing him through quickly. He applied for the posting to New South Wales and was subsequently appointed by the Prince Regent, who was, of course, later George IV, in August 1819. And he became a colonial chaplain. And interestingly enough too, he was also given a Lambeth Master of Arts by the Archbishop of Canterbury. And that wasn't unusual. The Archbishop of Canterbury could, if you like, allocate a degree to someone like Middleton, who was going out into one of the colonies. So sailing on the ship, the Prince Regent, Middleton arrived in Sydney on the 27th of January 1820, and he had with him his son, and he brought a nanny to look after his son as well. And he initially served as assistant chaplain in Sydney, and soon afterwards was transferred to the parish of Parramatta to become an officiating chaplain. That was Marsden's parish, and at the time Marsden was on one of his missions to New Zealand. So Middleton, having been a priest for just 6 months, most of which was on a ship coming out to the colony, and with absolutely minimum training, he had no mentor to teach him when he arrived here. So he was really on his own. And of course, being quite busy too. He, like Cowper, in his first year at Parramatta, conducted 73 marriages in the 1 year, and any amount of funerals too. But while he was at Parramatta, Middleton learned to carry out not only his pastoral role, but he was able to witness firsthand how the clergy in the colony could improve their position in life and accumulate wealth, just as Marsden had done. So Middleton was very, very strongly influenced by this, and remembering that he was a sizer, he had come from fairly humble background, so he saw an opportunity here to improve his lot in life. So he started to acquire his own land and livestock to supplement his income. Chaplains in those days were allocated £250, which in today's money is about $50,000. So in Parramatta, his position as a chaplain was highly respected in the community, and he associated, of course, with a lot of wealthy free settlers. So he started to build up his own rural interests too. So following the Big Commission recommendation and submissions also by Marsden and Cowper, by government order of the 10th of March 1821, Middleton was appointed the first resident chaplain to Newcastle. He was appointed to Newcastle to minister to the convicts, who at the time were described as the most abandoned and unfortunate of our species, which doesn't make it sound terribly good for those that were actually convicts here. And Middleton was the only chaplain north of the Hawkesbury River. So he continued in Parramatta until July 1821, and he left on foot. And he had 174 head of cattle by then, and so he drove them from Parramatta through to Newcastle, and of course knocked down a lot of trees and created a track on his way through it. And that track ended up being known as the Parsons Road. He moved into the parsonage. If you have a look at that map, you'll see two circles on it. The larger circle on the top left is the church, and the blue circle bottom right, that's the parsonage just across the road from Christ Church. At the time he arrived, Newcastle had a population of 1,169 people, and of those 1,169, 1,070 of them were convicts. Again, Middleton quickly found that as a clergyman, he wasn't well received in Newcastle. Most of them were hardened criminals, and they were full of hostility and resentment towards anybody who had authority. And of course, the settlement or township was under strict military discipline too, still with severe punishment. Middleton, as a clergyman, was seen as part of the governing authority, and he was well and truly shunned by the convicts. The fact that he had a few of the convicts flogged probably didn't do his status in the town terribly good, but a lot of, he'd had things stolen from his property, from his house, from his garden, so he was entitled to have them flogged. So because the convicts pretty much shunned him, Middleton, in travelling through his chaplaincy, spent a lot of time with the settlers in the area. He was able to feel comfortable with them, and they felt comfortable with him too. So during his first year in Newcastle, Middleton also received a glebe of 400 acres at Patterson's Plains, and you can just see at the bottom there, Middleton's glebe. It was in the Patterson's Plain area, pretty much north of, slightly northeast of Maitland. Within 18 months, he and his convict people had cleared 14 acres, and they were planting wheat and also grazing cattle, horses and pigs. Even though he had the property to look after, he was able to have the convicts manage it for him so he could spend most of his time on his pastoral duties. On the 17th of February 1824, Middleton remarried to a lady by the name of Sarah Rose, who came from a family of free settlers. At the time, he was 33, she was 15, and they ultimately had 15 children. His son George was still living with the nanny in Sydney at the time. And Middleton, because he'd been a teacher in England, continued teaching in Newcastle using the vestry in the church as a classroom. So Middleton clashed badly with the Newcastle commandant. He accused Morisset of setting a bad example to the convicts. He said that Morisset had a mistress who was in fact his housekeeper, and he also had an illegitimate child by another lady, and he also didn't observe the Sabbath, and Middleton also accused him of defrauding the government. So Middleton wrote to the Colonial Secretary and to Governor Brisbane complaining about this, and of course Morisset didn't take this terribly well. So he was still cranky with Middleton for having created the Parsons Road, because it created an avenue for the escaping convicts in Newcastle to get back to Sydney. So Morisset wasn't terribly happy about that. He also withdrew support for Middleton. Up till then, he'd been allocating soldiers and boats and boat crews to take Middleton around his chaplaincy. So he withdrew all of that, and then he in turn complained to the governor that about Middleton's absenteeism. Morisset left Newcastle later that year in 1824. Now we come to a very serious character who arrived in the colony, and he ended up having a real bad impact on Middleton and the two chaplains that came after him. Doesn't look too good with a blank photo there. This is the Venerable Thomas Hobbes Scott. I cannot get an image of him anywhere. I thought, being the first archdeacon in the colony, there would have been any amount of portraits or whatnot of him. Not so. I've gone through state libraries, ask a librarian, you name it, and I haven't been able to get an image of him. There may be one in England, so I've got to keep following that line and see if I can track him down. So arriving in the colony in May 1825, Thomas Hobbes Scott came to New South Wales as the first archdeacon of New South Wales. And at that stage of the game, New South Wales was part of the Diocese of Calcutta. That might sound a bit odd, but that was the nearest British diocese that was closest to Australia. So New South Wales became an archdeaconry under Bishop Wilson in Calcutta. The archdeaconry had been created the year before, again as a result of the Big Commission, and Hobbes had previously been a clerk in a British consulate in France and also one in Venice, and he'd also been a bankrupt wine merchant, which is not a great background, I suppose. And he'd also been secretary to Commissioner John Thomas Bigg, who was in fact his brother-in-law. So when Scott returned to England after the inquiry, he was effectively fast-tracked into the clergy. He was made a deacon and ordained priest very, very quickly in 1821. And maybe for political reasons, he was made archdeacon over Marsden. Marsden had been in the colony for 30 years, and Scott was made archdeacon over him, which is a bit funny. As I mentioned earlier, chaplains at the time were paid £250, and Scott's annual salary was to be in the order of £2,000, equivalent in 2021 to $380,000, and he'd have the rank of Lieutenant Governor. In 1826, I'll go back one. Middleton received 1,000 acres adjoining his glebe, which he called Glenrose Farm, and that's now part of Tokal Agricultural College. And he became quite well off financially. While in Newcastle, he developed a good relationship with the Yorobical people and spent time with them fishing and talking, and he introduced Threlkeld to the mission. Middleton ended up clashing badly with his archdeacon, who accused him of being incompetent and not doing his work properly, not understanding that Middleton had a large area to get around in the Hunter Valley and Port Stephens. So Scott kept up the pressure on Middleton to the point where in May 1827, Scott ordered Middleton to go to Port Macquarie, and he refused and resigned and retired to his farm. So Scott left the colony in 1829 and was replaced as Archdeacon by William Grant Broughton, who later became Bishop of Australia and Bishop of Sydney, but again, that's another story for another day. Middleton's property did well until the drought in 1831, and he went broke, moved to Sydney and became a teacher. He continued the Sydney school until November 1837, when Reverend Cowper licensed him as a minister to the parish of Seaham Butterwick. And if you just look at the top right there, you'll see a blue outline. That's the Seaham Butterwick parish. And Middleton had moved to Phoenix Park, which you can see sort of middle left there. And Bishop Broughton further licensed Middleton to conduct marriages from his house too. But by 1847, Middleton's health was deteriorating, but he kept on with his pastoral duties. And when William Terrell was enthroned Bishop of Newcastle in Christchurch on the 31st of January 1848, Middleton attended, but he couldn't participate, probably because he was quite ill, and he died 4 months later on the 15th of May 1848, aged 56. And he's buried, as I said earlier, and you saw the headstone, in Morpeth Cemetery. There's a stained glass window dedicated to him in the baptistry at Christchurch Cathedral, and it was donated by his son. Yeah, so obviously the chaplains had a lot of hardship when they were out here. If I can just finish again on a personal note, William Eckford, of course, as I mentioned earlier, was the harbour pilot from 1814 to 1822, and when he was recommended for a pardon in November 1821, two of the signatures on the recommendation were by the Reverend George Augustus Middleton and Brevet Major James Morissette. So there's kind of there's another story in that, but that's for another day too. So I'll finish on that note. Thank you very much for listening.
Any very quick questions for Ian?
Very quick question.
So that portrait's come down through your family, Ian?
This one?
The one of Eckford, yeah.
Yeah, that was in the Newcastle City Library for quite some time. And there's copies of that portrait and his wife, Mary Horrell, in the dining room at Customs House as well. And Suzanne pointed that one out to me, thanks.
It was also good to see a painting of Wallace, because I know that many years ago you couldn't find one, could you?
Well, I carry one in my wallet now. Elizabeth Ellis from the Mitchell Library gave me a fine one, and so I carried that, and on the other side I have Document Corrie, so if anyone would like to see, along with my family photos.
There may be hope just yet for a painting of Middleton. So I remember speaking with Brian, and he was lamenting that a lot of Middleton's papers weren't available. Can you comment on those? Because it would be wonderful. We seem to have a missing gap with Aboriginal papers from Middleton. I mean, We've got his 1846 returns on Aboriginal people that he knew, but it's like there must have been much more.
I'm sure there were. Obviously, with the sort of research I've been doing, the focus has started on the cathedral, and then it branched into just the chaplains, bishops and deans. And I just haven't been able to explore further than that. As anybody that's ever done research knows, you start running down rabbit holes all the time, and then you've got to pull yourself back. And so my focus has been along those lines. But as you know better than anyone, you find all sorts of things in all sorts of places. So who knows what's going to turn up.
All right, any questions from the Zoomers before we... Okay. Sorry, you can say something.
Can I just quickly comment that...
Okay.
That
Yes, and review also the information that the family have provided us about Morissette as well, for a balanced view. Anyway, thank you very much, Ian, for that. And you're a living example of living history with your family background.